All right, well, welcome to this lecture where we are looking at Chandran Kukathas' position on immigration, which for him is open immigration, which he thinks is the most just kind of way to do immigration. So let's look, for instance, at who Chandran Kukathas is. Himself is a very important, popular social and political philosopher who currently is the head of the political theory department at the London School of Economics in England. He himself uh, is an immigrant in that he was born in Malaysia, but some years later had immigrated to Australia, and even after that had immigrated from Australia to Great Britain to study and to teach where he currently works. And his basic argument is really this, that the more fundamental and basic moral principles that exist in the world, okay, just basic humane moral principles themselves require that there be no limit on the freedom of human beings when it comes to international travel, when it comes to international migration, and that morality itself, just very basically and very simply, requires nations to have open borders. Um, so it's very interesting, and in a sense, given the current political and social climate in the West, especially in the United States, one question we should ask then is, why does he think this, right? This is such a very different kind of argument from what we're used to hearing in our culture and in our society. Well, he gives some reasons for that, but he recognizes too at the outset that it's really important to understand that immigration is a problem in the sense that trying to figure out, trying to determine, even maybe trying to reform one's immigration policy is really rooted in all of the problems that are raised from having immigration to begin with. And of course, the biggest, probably the biggest issue anyway, when it comes to immigration and why many countries want to rethink it and at the very least restrict it in the way that they do, is because immigration imposes costs. And here's what we mean by that, or here's what Kukathis means by that. That is, that liberal democratic states are welfare states. So immigrants consume a large amount of public benefits. Now, when Kukathis is talking about liberal democratic states, he's talking about places like his home country of Australia and Great Britain, and especially the United States. The United States is a liberal democratic state. What do we mean by that? Well, it's liberal in the sense that that the power, that the governance of the state itself is given liberally across, right, the entire citizenry or the entire citizenship of people. We are a government. We are a nation by the people for the people. So we're liberally given power in order to set the direction and set the interests of the nation in which we live, of which we are citizens of. We do this democratically, right, as a people. We are a democratic republic. We are governed by laws, but it's us who sets those laws in motion. It's us who set policy perspectives in order so that certain kinds of laws and initiatives result from that. And we are a welfare state as a result of that. Now, what do we mean by a welfare state? Well, simply put, we are not a libertarian state where everybody secures their own stuff for themselves. We don't secure our own education, our own public roadways, or our own roadways. Um, we don't secure our own garbage and trash service, right? All of this stuff is paid for from us contributing to the public purse, if you want to put it that way, or the public account through taxes, right? Taxes are collected from us in order to spread these benefits, in order to spread this welfare across the board for everyone who's a citizen or even simply just a resident of the country. That means that you have to pay, that somebody has to pay for every student that goes into the high school here in town or the elementary school around the corner. This is done through welfare, that is through taxes, um, so that it can be provided for all children to attend that school. So when you have immigrants that themselves, by virtue of merely being a resident here, will automatically be eligible for the public welfare benefits like that, they're going to consume a lot of it. especially since at some point they may not be able to totally afford every aspect of what is the usual American lifestyle. And so there might even be extra or added benefits provided to them that wouldn't be for most Americans. So immigration is costly. When you bring people in that will take advantage of these benefits that are provided for everybody, that adds costs. So this is why immigration really is a problem. It's because the modern state, like the United States, is like a club, right? It's like a club. We take in new members of our club here reluctantly, simply because the cost of having added membership is so high. We've got to be very careful. We've got to be very selective. We've got to be very limited on who we allow into our club, because every new member means we have to provide more benefits for the members in general of the club, and that just drives up the price of what it is to be a member of the club. So that's the problem. But despite that problem, Kukathas thinks that borders nonetheless should still be open. And why? Why should we not have closed borders? Well, reason number one he gives is what he calls the principle of freedom. Now, for him, this is a very basic, foundational, bedrock moral principle. And it's the principle that when it comes to being a human being, when it comes to living as an autonomous human agent in the world, right, that there are basic human rights that we have. And one of the ones that is so basic and most basic is this principle we have to freely do what we want to do, which involves the freedom of being able to go where we want to go. So the principle of freedom simply is that closed borders restrict movement. And since free movement is an important human value that we have and that we share in virtue of being persons, closed borders are in tension with that value. Closed borders actually go against that value. And for this reason, closed borders themselves would be immoral, as Kukathas sees it. What is it that closed borders restrict? Well, in a very technical sense, they restrict the freedom of movement. People don't have the freedom to move, to go, and to come, and to live about their lives freely, like they would like to do, right? And we think that this is a problem. It's been interesting in the most recent era that we've been living in here, the era of COVID, the era of the pandemic, how many countries have closed their borders. I have in-laws, for instance, who live in Canada, and although my wife is allowed to go there because she is a citizen of Canada as well as of the United States, I'm only a citizen of the U.S. I'm not a citizen there, and so Canada won't let me in. Part of it's like, hey, that's okay. If Canada won't let me in, then I have a great excuse as to why I have to tell my in-laws, oh, I can't come see you, right? And I can act all really sad about that. Um, but other part of me is like, who are you to restrict my freedom, right? I mean, I'm an autonomous human being here. I have the right to go wherever I want to go. I have the right to come into your country, especially since I have family there. Who are you to keep me out? Right? So, sort of attitude. I guess that's the American coming out in me, which is meaningless when it comes to Canada because it's not America, right? But anyway, right? We tend to think that these kinds of things are very unjust because we have a basic idea of a basic fundamental right called freedom. I think also that what closed borders restrict is the freedom of buying and selling our labor and goods, right? There's something very fundamental to being a human being, and that is that we trade, that we have economic, monetary goods and services transactions with other human beings, right? This is how we survive. One person becomes specialized, say, in making furniture, and another person becomes specialized in raising beef cattle, and maybe someone else specializes um, in doing electrical and plumbing work on your house. And so all three of those different people are all able to eat beef cattle well, have a lot of beef in their freezer, have really good electricity and water, and have really nice furniture. Why? Because they all are able to do everything? Well, no, it's because they're able to buy and sell and trade their expertise, their goods, their services for other goods and services. And this is just how economics works. This is how human flourishing works and how we're able to all enjoy the benefits of everyone's expertise because we're able to trade that expertise back and forth to get the biggest advantage and the most efficient goods and services that we can get. Well, guess what? Closed borders keep that from happening. I mean, it's a very basic thing that we need to live as human beings. And when borders are closed, it means that we can't do that. And Kukathas sees that as uh, real violence against this freedom that we have, that is a fundamental value of what it is to be a human being. And of course, closed borders restrict freedom of association, right? This is a very important, even constitutional value, a principle that undergirds so many of the values that we have in our United States Constitution. That is for the purposes of religion, religious exercise, or free speech, um, or what have you, right? That we have the freedom to associate with people whom we want to associate with for whatever those purposes might be. Um, and closed borders restrict that. Closed borders say, no, you can't associate with these other people. Um, and so artificially doing violence to that principle. A second principle that Kukathis mentions is this, what he calls the principle of humanity. So this isn't so much sort of the basic human value regarding freedom that we have in virtue of our humanity to live free lives and to be free people, right? Uh, Give me liberty or give me death type stuff, but rather that there's a certain um, minimal level of human flourishing, of human subsistence, that itself is part and parcel of what it is to be uh, a civilized human, to live in a civilized humanity. And with the principle of humanity, or our sort of humane reaction that we have to one another in terms of empathy with one another as human beings, requires us to open borders simply because so much of the world's population lives in poverty. And for many of those who live in this poverty, the best way to make their conditions better is for them to move. It's for them to get out of the place where their poverty is, and to go to where things are better. I think we have so many examples of that that we can point to in history, right? Even locally. I think I've mentioned before in a lecture that my own family of the past 100 years have been somewhat of nomads, moving around this country, where there's been better opportunities, where there's been work, uh, not really tied to any particular place, but just going to where the work is, to where our condition can be best enjoyed in this country. And of course, the same can be said for so many people, even who have moved internationally. Think about the late 19th, early 20th century, people coming from places like Ireland, where there's a great famine, and immigrating to the United States, where they could actually grow food and live good lives. Those who left under horrible conditions during World War II, especially those with Jewish ancestry, who frankly wanted to go somewhere where they were not going to be euthanized simply for being Jewish, right? I mean, we have we have examples of this time after time after time, of people indeed who have needed to go somewhere simply just to exist, so they could just subsist, frankly. And what Kukathis says is that the principle of humanity requires us to have open borders, right? Simply for this reason, so people can improve their condition and live good human lives. And if you turn these people away, you've got to have a really good reason for doing so. If your borders are going to be closed to these kinds of people, whatever that good reason might be, such as intentional violence in their past, or maybe public health reasons, or so on and so forth, right? Those might be good reasons, but you're going to have to need one, or else you're going to be acting very inhumanely and very uncompassionately towards them, whereas um, um, whereas morality itself would demand that we be compassionate to these folks. And if you turn them away, something else you're doing is denying them an opportunity to really help themselves. You're denying them the opportunity to come into a place like the United States, for instance, where here is a context in which they can take advantage of the tools and resources, um, really in order to make their own way in life, in order to educate themselves and get specialized jobs, and make money, and then become taxpayers, paying some of that money back, right? That are part of the cost of immigration, right? It's so by not taking them in, it's not so much that you're denying them the benefit of sort of taking care of them the rest of their lives, but allowing them the opportunity to take care of themselves for the rest of their lives. And thus, what you're doing is you're denying them the opportunity to help them. Or no, I'm sorry, you're denying others the opportunity to help them. What you are doing is you are denying the rest of the citizenry, the rest of the populace of the country, from even being able to reach out and help them. There had been a lot of talk in the past few years, especially during the time of the Syrian refugee crisis, where many people in the United States said, let the Syrian refugees come over here. We'll cover it personally. We'll have them live with us. We'll help them get started. We'll help them get going. And so many in the federal government and immigration service said, no, we're not going to go that route. We're not going to allow that to happen at a mass scale as what people were requesting. And there's a sense in which if or I am a citizen of the U.S., and if that was me, if I wanted to take in some people uh, to help them improve their lives, I would feel slighted by my own government. I think, in a sense, well, who are you as a government to tell me that I can't help other people? You're denying me my freedom, my right to help others who really need my help. And I might see that as something of a violence that the government is committing against me. But whether or not that's the case, right? The basic idea here is that the principle of humanity, this principle that humans are valuable, you might even say they have a right to life, they have a right to a minimum subsistence of life, to control their lives, to govern their lives, to take care of themselves, and thus a right to at least have an opportunity to be able to do that on their own. And that by restricting that, in terms of immigration, you are restricting, in a sense, their right to life. I guess you're restricting their humanity at a very deep level. Now, Kukathas then looks at some of the economic arguments, though, that people make against open borders. So somebody might say, "Oh yeah, your principle of humanity, your principle of freedom, sure, there's some truth to that, but it's kind of pie in the sky. Let's be real. You, Kukathis, you've already noted that immigration imposes costs, right? So let's talk about these costs. Let's get sort of down and dirty with the economics of this to show how that at the end of the day, let's be consequentialists. Let's be utilitarians and show that at the end of the day, it really doesn't provide the most amount of good for the most amount of people to have open borders." So what are some of these claims or these arguments that people make? Well, one argument has to do with the migrant impact on local markets. So somebody might argue that if you look at the data and you look at historically how this happens when it comes to mass immigration, that whenever you have migrants who move into a particular locale, that wages end up being driven down and prices are pushed up. Um, well, why is that? Well, we have examples where we can show how that when you have immigration of people who come in who are low skilled or no skilled, that they will end up doing and offering their services at much lower prices than people, let's say, who have businesses that do that kind of work. So if I've got people here in my town that I live in who do drywall work, for instance, and they've had a family business for 50 years doing drywall, sheetrock work, and do a good job of it, and all of a sudden there's no skilled migrants who move into town, and they don't have a whole lot of opportunity. They're willing to do that same work for 20% of what this established business is doing the work for. Well, they're going to drive down wages. They're going to drive down the wage that people can make doing that, right? There's more competition there among them. Indeed, it might even end up putting the established business out of business, right? I mean, this does happen. So there's that. And the flip side of that is that now that there's more people in town here who want to buy the loaf of bread that's over here at Walmart, and there's the same amount of bread that's available to sell, more people want to buy that, more people are going to competing for that. It makes the price go up, right? Walmart can get more for that bread because more people want it. And so how does Walmart keep a run on bread from happening at Walmart? Um, they do it by rising the price up so that it makes it harder to get, and in a sense, it ends up eliminating the amount of people who can't afford that bread. I'm just using that as an example, right? This is the argument that people give. If you have a lot of people who move into a locale who don't have a whole lot of skills, uh, they'll do what it takes to work. Whatever they can get paid to work, they'll get paid even if it's very minimal. And that there's more demand on things like groceries, it drives prices up. A second claim that these people will make also, or a second economic argument against open borders, uh, is that you have to think about how migrants impact the cost and availability of state-supplied goods and services, right? So this kind of goes back to the problem that Kukathas identified earlier when it comes to immigration. That is, it costs a lot of money. Things like education, right, is provided for. Education is a public welfare. It's a social good that is provided in a social way, especially in the state in which we live. Everybody is entitled to a K through 12 education and can get it because the state will pay for it for everybody. Well, if we have a lot of new people that move into our state, that means that the state has to pay for more kids in that education system, as well as healthcare, Medicare and Medicaid, as well as various sorts of welfare assistance, or what we traditionally would call welfare assistance, things like food support and shelter and so on and so forth. Roads, you have more people who move here, you have more people using the roads wear out a little faster, or you may even need to make more roads or wider roads to handle all the traffic. Public parks, the same sort of principle. The more people you have using them, the more you're going to have to repair them or keep them up or even expand them in order to supply that for everybody. So it makes the cost of everything go up in terms of what our tax dollars pay for. So if we're going to have these kinds of things managed well, education, healthcare, welfare, roads, parks, etc., well, then the consumers of these things, right, that is you and me and everybody else who uses them, it has to be limited. If we were to have more people doing these kinds of things and using these kinds of things, taking care of these state supplied goods and services, the cost goes up. So we need to limit those who actually consume them, those who actually use them and take advantage of them. That being the case, then open borders would create an even greater burden on taxpayers. We'd have to pay more taxes, or we would need more taxpayers in order to pay for the goods and services that are going to be used and utilized by migrants. Well, here's how Kukathis responds to those arguments. First of all, he says, actually, if you look at the data, the impact of immigration is positive. And it's mildly positive, but it's positive because what happens is that migrants expand the workforce. Now we have more people who can do these kinds of jobs than we had before. So what it does then is it increases the division of labor. There's more specialization that takes place across the new populace that has moved in, more people able to do these very specialized jobs and even bringing new skill sets and new ideas, making the division of labor that much more diverse and that much more to our benefit as an entire nation or entire state or entire community where these people live. And that's what it does is it grows the consumer base. In other words, you got to think about it both ways. Sure, all these people indeed um, uh, might be needing or might be all demanding that same loaf of bread, but it gives the people who make the bread more of an incentive now to make more bread so that they can be more competitive with others then who realize that there are more people who want bread, and so there's a market for making more bread for these people and making more money by selling bread to these people, right? So all of this stuff is interconnected, and the data sort of bears this out. That indeed, that there are benefits here to be understood, to be realized by this. Um, Also think about it in this way: what immigration does is it moves people from places where they are less productive to places where they can be more productive. It moves them from places where they can't or don't have as much opportunity to exercise their skill set and contribute to their communities and societies to places where they can to a greater extent and to a better extent. And this is a good thing. But now someone obviously is going to rise up, and it might even be me, and because I've seen this happen, and I ask the question to Kukathis and says, okay, this makes sense. I'm not disagreeing with you, but what we do know is that there is um, at least a sort of shock effect that happens from this, because whenever you bring in people that provide labor for a lot cheaper of a cost than what currently is the case, it ends up taking jobs away from native workers, from people who have already lived in those communities and have done those jobs for 40 and 50 years, and it drives down everybody's wages. Right, you're taking away what mom and pops companies have established, what local tradespeople have established, and what you're doing is you're bringing people who can work for a lot less. And so it really throws everything out of sorts. And by driving down the wages, in a way, it kind of brings down the standard of living that people are able to have when they do those kinds of jobs. And here's what Kukathas says in response to that. Okay, but why are local people, why are native people, native to that area, why are they entitled to benefits of having immediate access to markets, jobs, to wages? In other words, why does the person who has done drywall in this county for 50 years, why is he or she entitled to that? Why does he or she have exclusive privilege to doing that job over anyone else who wants to do it or can do it even for a little bit cheaper? And of course, this is a rhetorical question, right? Because Kukathis thinks the response, and our response is going to be, well, nobody has an exclusive privilege to it. Um, I can give you a good example of that from my own life. So I grew up around Detroit, Michigan, right, known as the Motor City. All kinds of automobile factories there. All the American car companies are based there, and by American I mean those that are headquartered in America. Uh, General Motors, Ford Motor Company, and Chrysler, which right now is known as Fiat Chrysler, and it's actually changed its name to something else. And I should know that because I have a lot of family that work for Chrysler, but it's not really called that anymore. Anyway, I'm slightly embarrassed right now. I don't remember the new name, but I haven't been up there in a while. Growing up, there was always a sort of disdain for places like Alabama that would give companies like Honda and Toyota and Hyundai and other Asian car companies tax abatements for coming to Alabama and setting up car factories and hiring people at a much lower wage than what you can make if you work in a car factory in Detroit. Indeed, down here, people are paid less than half of what people are paid in Detroit for doing the same job in a car factory. Um, and so there's always some disdain for that because, frankly, it means that the car companies here are able to take advantage of the fact that people here in Alabama will work for less money, and thus they can sell the cars themselves at a lesser price or a more competitive price than what they can sell the GM, Ford, and Chryslers for, and have better access to a market and sell more cars that way. And then the state subsidizes that by not making these car companies in the state of Alabama here pay taxes like what they have to pay also up in Michigan. So it's a double whammy, right? Chrysler, Ford, and GM have to pay their normal taxes on their properties, on their information, um, on their equipment, I should say, on their properties, as well as pay people more money, an hourly wage. Whereas in Alabama, car companies here pay people less of an hourly wage, as well as don't have to pay taxes on any of their equipment or their property. So it's a much better deal economically here. And so, reasonably enough, a lot of people where I grew up see that as being incredibly unfair. It's really hard to compete with that. It's incredibly unfair that jobs then would end up being taken away as car companies up north have to shrink or downsize or even go out of business. So the question then is that morally right or wrong? Well, if Kukathis is right, it's not the case that people back home where I grew up have some exclusive right and privilege to doing that job for the amount of money that they do it for. If someone can do that job here in Alabama for less money and is willing to do it for less money, well, they have as much right to it as someone who's going to maybe end up losing their job in Michigan because they won't be able to sell as many cars given the cost of making those cars, including the salaries they have to pay people to make those cars. And it goes to, but the chain keeps going on. If someone in China is willing to do that job for a lot less money than what somebody here in Alabama is doing, then somebody here in Alabama is probably going to lose their job to someone in China who can do it cheaper. That's just how it works. Nobody has an exclusive privilege to whatever it is that they do for a living, right? They have to be competitive. They have to provide a good service. And there's other factors that local communities do here. Uh, but if that's the truth, I mean, if no one really is entitled to a particular market, to a particular job, to a particular wage that they make, um, well then borders really don't need to be closed, do they? That's Kukathas's point. Number two, The real problem of migrants consuming state-supplied goods is not all about immigrants, okay? It's really just about poor ones. In other words, what Kukathas is saying is that even though we might look at this problem of immigration as being the costs that are involved with that, it's not so much really that what our focus then is on immigration as such. Because what if we had immigrants who could come and pay for everything out of their own dime, on their own dime, and out of their own pocket, such that they required no um, um, help, no assistance uh, from us as a society whatsoever. They were able to cover all of their own costs. Well, the way that we know that immigration works is that that kind of already is the case. In other words, people who are in a better financial position are actually more likely to be given approval to immigrate to the U.S. Than those who don't have those resources or access to resources. And this goes along with Kukathas's point that what it is we're concerned about, if we're concerned about the cost of immigration, really isn't about immigrants in general. It's about poor ones. It's about those who are really going to cost us money. So it's the poor ones that we want to keep out. And that's what Kukathis says closed borders really is about, or at least this is one really important, crucial purpose, as he puts it, to closed borders, or why we have closed borders. It's because we want to keep out poor people. It's because we want to keep out uh, those people who indeed will require things of us, who require money from us, who require social benefits for us, from us. We don't want to have to pay their tab. Okay. But as Kukathis puts it, if the concern really is about restricting privileges of the welfare system broadly construed, so things like public roads and parks, things like public education as provided to all residents of the U.S., then why is it that we tie this to immigration? We really don't need to, right? If what we're concerned about is not having poor people come into the United States, for instance, then what we should do is do welfare reform. What we should do then is start restricting access to these things that cost us money rather than close borders. I mean, if a poor person is going to be poor in Southwest China or poor in the United States, where would it be a better place to be poor? Well, probably better to be poor in the United States, where at least you have access to things that you can take advantage of to try to make your lot better, to try to make your life better. Even without any sort of government assistance, but through private charities and through others who would be willing to help, um, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps and have a better life here than you could anywhere else. So Kukathis says, do welfare reform. Quit paying for everybody to have everything. Um, don't close the borders. Now, what about the nationality argument then against open borders? And this argument really based on this assumption that the well-being of a state's citizens takes precedence over that of outsiders. This is generally the sort of posture that David Miller takes in that particular argument and position that we looked at on this particular topic. That is that people are tied together by sort of by their national kinship, by being part of the same nation, by, at least in the case of the United States, uh, uh, by being of one accord in terms of the creed that we have to live free, to govern ourselves in the way in which we do. And that national kinship itself gives us special duties or imposes on us special duties to one another. Um, and thus responsibilities that we have for one another, such that that is what really takes precedence over any sort of concern that we have for other people. Not that we hate other people from other places or care less about them. It's not the case at all. It's just that our priority of concern is for one another than it is for outsiders. And so what this nationality argument then says is that immigration is damaging to all of this because it changes the cultural character of a state or of a nation, right? It changes the culture in lots of different ways and then has the potential of really sort of getting rid of the ancient identity that has been hard fought and that has come through organically that particular community or that particular locale. Miller would also argue that it damages countries whose wealth is dependent upon a particular political culture or particular kinds of economic and social institutions that help create that wealth and maintain that wealth, right? We have a way of doing wealth. We have a way of doing economics, for instance, here in the United States. And so bringing lots of people from other places that do it very differently, where there might be more central control, more monarchical control or dictatorial control, or maybe even more democratic control, more central government kinds of control, um, who basically have that kind of worldview, right? Whatever it is, if you bring a lot of people over who have that kind of mindset about it, well, that's going to eventually be influential. It's going to filter through the system and how things are thought about, and eventually change how all of that is done. And then another argument, aspect of this, is that immigration can be damaging to the nation, damaging to our priorities of being concerned with one another before we're concerned with anybody else, because it makes the solidarity that we're able to achieve socially very difficult because of all these various ideas and principles that we have that are so diverse around the globe regarding justice, regarding what social justice is, regarding what the minimal level of standards should be of living, and how that ought to be achieved, and whether that ought to be achieved within a particular society. Well, last slide for this lecture, and I'll simply look at Kukathas' response to all of that here, and then we'll call it a day. First of all, Kukathas says, it's not always a bad thing for immigrants to change the character of a place. You might even think that in some situations, it's a good thing when immigrants come to communities that are somewhat stale or somewhat on the downside, and they sort of revive it. They bring some new life and new breath to that, or indeed, they may bring some better ideas to that. Um, we might argue that even in the history of the United States, this has always been the case, given that the United States, frankly, is a nation of immigrants, of people who, over the course of 300 and 400 years, have come from various places across the world into this really amazing melting pot that we are in the U.S., and have brought lots of benefits in order to make the U.S. The wonderful place that it is. Secondly, many societies that have experienced significant cultural and social change through immigration have prospered as a result, right? There has been waves of communities that indeed have come to create and sustain more wealth because of immigration, have been able to provide really good and important benefits to its residents due to immigration. And then thirdly, the nation state, as Kukathas puts it, at the end of the day, is really not the right place for answering and settling questions regarding distributive justice itself, regarding what minimal levels of standard of living should be, such that should be provided for by taxpayers and through welfare assistance and things like that. Why is that? Well, think about a place like the United States. Really, how would Washington, D.C., and by Washington, D.C., I mean the bureaucracies, the center of government, officials, all that sort of thing. How and why could it be that a place like Washington, D.C. could figure out for the entire country what the minimal standard of living should be? I ask that question because the locality where I am recording this lecture in North Alabama, how about I just say North Central Alabama? We'll put it that way. The cost of living here is relatively low compared to places like San Francisco, California, or uh, Seattle, Washington, or New York City. Okay. Um, I'll give you an example of this. Recently, a friend reached out to me about a job opportunity in um, Los Angeles. I'm trying to think where it was. Los Angeles. And said this college was interested, wanted to talk to me about coming and potentially working there as a professor. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. I don't know how much I'd really want to move to California, frankly, uh, culturally speaking, anyway. But okay, it's kind of interesting. And then he said, yeah, and they're going to pay you, or like the starting salary is this amount. He told me the number, and I'm thinking, wow, that's pretty good. So I kind of thought about that later. It's like, well, it would definitely be a pay increase from what I'm currently making in terms of a yearly salary. So maybe I should think about that. Well, in the course of thinking about it, I started looking at some things. Pardon me. I started looking at some things that sort of helped me understand how much it would cost to live there. So I looked at some housing prices, looked at the price of gasoline, right, at some gas stations in that community, looked at what the tax rates were and how those kind of worked. Also, looked at well, the cost of groceries, how much does a gallon of milk cost in suburban Los Angeles, and so on and so forth. Um, and what I came to realize was that, you know, I would be pretty much living paycheck to paycheck in Southern California on that salary. It's a lot more than what I make here in North Central Alabama. But because the cost of living is so much lesser, I'm actually able to live fairly well here and have good savings left over after I pay my bills every month. Um, so in other words, the point we're trying to get at here is that things cost differently throughout the entire country, right? And Kukathas's point is that if we're going to try to figure out what the best minimal level of distributive justice is and how benefits are provided for people or what we think the minimum standard of living should be, this needs to be figured out at the community level, not at the state level, not at the nation level, rather. It's not Washington's business to do this. It really should be local communities figuring this out for themselves because the costs and expenses and benefits of things differ so much throughout the nation, differ so much throughout the entire country. Well, if that's the case, if the federal level, the nation level, the country level is not the appropriate place for determining questions regarding distributive justice, well then that is no longer an issue. It's a non-issue regarding immigration. It's not a complaint, it's not a criticism then that should arise when responding to these issues regarding immigration. Anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed this lecture and are thinking hard about this. As always, you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me and I would be so glad to respond to them. Thank you.